Hello, BookTube. Well, as promised, I have something new for you, something different than just me bloviating. Instead, there are two people bloviating. I have an author. This is James Verini.
Hi.
He's the author of this book, They Will Have to Die Now, which is about the fall of the Caliphate. It's about the Battle of Mosul. And it's your first book.
It is my first book, that's right.
And I thought we would start off by you just telling all of my viewers a little bit about you and a little bit about the book.
Sure. So I'm a longtime magazine journalist, before that a newspaper journalist. I've written for lots of magazines. At the moment I'm a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine and National Geographic Magazine. I have written about many different subjects, but lately, in the last decade, it's mainly been about conflict. I lived in Africa, in Kenya for 4 years, and wrote about conflict there, and in the Middle East and in Latin America. And in 2016, in the war against ISIS, as it was playing out in Iraq, not Syria, ISIS was on its heels. It was finally getting beaten by the Iraqi forces, and I proposed to my editors at National Geographic that I go there and go to Iraq and write about life in the Caliphate, because for the first time in a few years you could go into these portions of Iraq that had until recently been the Islamic State, been the Caliphate, and meet people who had been living, in this regime, in places like Fallujah and Tikrit and Ramadi. And so I went and did that for a month on assignment for National Geographic. And it became obvious while I was there doing that reporting that the battle for Mosul would soon begin. And everyone knew that the battle for Mosul would be the climactic, the central battle of this war, at least as it was playing out in Iraq, and even bigger than any battle of Syria. In Syria, Aleppo had been destroyed, as you know, but it wasn't really in battle. It was mainly destroyed by airstrikes, government airstrikes. Mosul, however, would be a battle, a house-to-house, street-to-street battle, and everyone knew that it would be the major battle of this war, and that if it was retaken, as it certainly would have to be eventually, that would mean the end of the Caliphate in Iraq. By that point, by the Battle of Mosul, or by June of 2014, when ISIS took Mosul, they controlled most of northwestern Iraq, which is an astonishing accomplishment.
And it was a bragging point for them.
It was a bragging point for them, and they did it in a short matter of months. And in Syria, it wasn't too surprising that they had taken ground, because Syria was in the midst of a civil war. And there were many jihadi groups and other militias taking ground. In Iraq, it was far more astounding. Iraq was and is a middle-income, mainly developed country for all its problems. It was just astonishing when ISIS took as much ground as it did in Iraq, and specifically took the second or third largest city in the country, namely Mosul. I would say that the day that in June of 2014, when ISIS took Mosul, it marked a sea change in warfare, just as surely as 9/11 had.
And there was a point, at some point, when you realized this was a book, not a feature article.
That's right. I had been there for a couple of months in Mosul reporting, and I was following the storyline of a family whom you'll remember from the book, Abu Omar and his brother Abu Fahad. I was also embedding regularly with the Iraqi troops, and I thought to myself, I'm certainly going to get a great article or two out of this. I ended up doing 2 articles for the Times Magazine. But I'm going to have much more material beyond that, and there's going to be much more I want to say, and much more I want to learn, which is you should always, I think you're starting a book, you should expect to and want to learn a great deal, not just say a great deal. And yeah, so I suppose it must have been in early 2017 that I thought to myself, this could become a book. But it wasn't until September of that year, after I'd been back from Mosul for 2 months, that I wrote the proposal and sold it.
The book, I don't want to put you on the spot, but it's brilliant.
Thank you.
It's belongs on a small shelf of the best war reporting of the 21st century.
Thank you.
And
What else would you put on that shelf? Out of curiosity.
Oh my. Well, nothing that I'm thinking of something like the Forever War,
Sure.
something like that.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a difference in your book running throughout it. It seems to be. I mean, maybe it was true. You can tell us, but it seems like there wasn't a tent, not a bunker, not a culvert, not a bombed out house that you weren't in.
I got around.
How did you get? I mean, you mentioned you thanks at the end of the book the handlers, the fixers that you always have when you're a correspondent in a foreign land. But it had to be more than that. How did you get so many different kinds of people to trust you?
That's a good question.
When you're an American.
Well, so as you know, war is mainly sitting around. So the Iraqi troops whom I was working with and bedding with, they would go in and take a neighborhood, and the battle moved very slowly. So over the course of a day, they would only take several streets. Let's say they would never even take an entire neighborhood in a day. They'd only take several streets of a neighborhood. Because they were moving forward very meticulously in order to try to force protection, but also, mainly, even more so, to protect the civilians. So you would move forward with them, and you would have all this time to talk to Moslawis about what life had been like and how they felt, and all this time to talk to the soldiers. And I also spent, 7 or 8 months there, covering just this battle. So I actually didn't see as much of Mosul as I would have liked, but you gather from the book that I saw a great deal of it. It's unlike most books about war, or most books that I've read, this is centered just in one city, and not a terribly large city by our standards. Mosul was a city of maybe 1.2 million before ISIS took it over, and it's not geographically terribly large. Which was terrific. I'm glad that it happened that way. I wouldn't want to write a sprawling book about an entire war. I wouldn't have wanted to write a book about the entire war against ISIS. It's too diffuse. You wouldn't get to know anyone particularly well from that book, right?
No.
And you wouldn't have a real sense of the story and the reality of combat, which, as I say, is usually very dull. When you read a book like Dexter's Forever War, as good as it is, he's just bringing you from scene to scene, and you get the sense that this was ongoing action. It's not.
Right.
It's even in the confines of a small battle, it's mainly boredom.
Yeah. Well,
for
military
everyone.
historians always say that.
For everyone, for the journalists, for the combatants, for the civilians.
But still, there are scenes in this book. You must have been in immediate danger of dying.
I suppose, yeah. I mean, it's a war.
But at one point, I always find this fascinating with war correspondence of any kind. At what point, or is there a point where the thought crosses your mind, I could just pull out of all this. I don't need to be here catching a bullet in the next 5 minutes. Right. I could just leave.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you always have that in the back of your mind, and ironically, that's what allows you to stay. If you had to be there, it would be much more claustrophobic and much more agonizing. The fact that you can leave whenever you want makes the staying not nearly so agonizing. And not agonizing at all. I certainly felt bored in Mosul, but usually not even that. There was always something to pay attention to. There was always someone to talk to. There was always some part of the city to describe. If you go to a new city, I go to a new city and I endlessly love to walk around it and look at every nook and cranny and talk to people. So imagine you're doing that in a city where there also happens to be a war. It's endlessly fascinating. I say that, despite my love of Moslawis and my sadness over what happened to their city.
And you're talking to all sorts of different people, the brothers that you mentioned, the major characters in this book, and the military figures. Yeah. And hovering over, well, in my reading anyway, hovering over so much of this book, a shadow just hovering over it all, is America.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, America is ever present in this book, even when it's usually not physically present, but it's always present in some way, even if it's just the sound of the airstrikes that I keep referring to in the artillery, because, of course, the Americans are running the ordnance portion of this war, right?
Never seems far
the Iraqi
from
field commanders are calling in the strikes, but it's the Americans that are arranging them. And on everyone's minds constantly is America. You're absolutely right. One, because ISIS would not exist, at least not in this way, and wouldn't be so successful if not for the American invasion of and occupation of Iraq. And also because in the minds of Iraqis, many Iraqis, the Iraqis I spoke to, as I try to describe in the book, America looms always. America, the Iraqi conception of American power, in the minds of many Iraqis I spoke to, is a power second only to God's. America to them seems omniscient and omnipotent. And I found that moving around Mosul and speaking with soldiers and civilians, that they believed that we were living in a world that I have never seen, which is a world run by extremely competent Americans.
A touchier subject than usual this week.
That world did exist at one time, but it was before I was born. It's not.
I'm not sure that Dwight Eisenhower would agree.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe not.
But I have two questions that spring from that. The first one, given this fact that this shadow of America is everywhere, it never seems more than two thoughts away from anybody that you talk to. How do you deal? Like you're in the middle of a book tour. Right?
Yeah.
You're going to be at the Harvard Bookstore tonight, if any of you are. Or the Coop? Is it the Coop or the Harvard Bookstore?
Bookstore, 7:00.
If any of you are in the Boston area, go and listen. You'll get a much more detailed talk than this, without a crazy schnauzer running around on the floor. But when you're doing this tour, when you're talking to people, or even in the composition of the book, how do you deal with the fact that, well, I don't know, maybe you didn't find it to be true. I would have to believe that a good 90% of the people, the Americans that you talk to, have no idea about this subject. They don't know anything about it at all.
Well, no, but only because I'm talking to a very specialized audience, right? I'm talking in a bookstore where people actually want to
the bookstore.
Hear about
the bookstore
that book.
Tonight, yes,
so
absolutely.
Presumably they have some foreknowledge or interest anyway. Certainly at the universities I've been talking at, people are very knowledgeable. In fact, there have been many Iraqis in the audiences at the universities. Americans followed the war against ISIS. I wouldn't say that the problem was American news consumers' ignorance about the war itself or the developments of the war. The problem, I would wager, was their ignorance about the origins of ISIS and the point of ISIS, if you like. The origins of ISIS, of course, being the American occupation. There are other origins that went farther back, but the immediate cause, undeniably, was the American era in Iraq. And I think what many American news consumers, and this is not exclusive to Americans, everyone around the world who paid attention to the rise and fall of ISIS, they did and still do and will continue to conceive of ISIS as mainly an extremist religious organization, thanks in large part to ISIS's own propaganda and to its conception of itself, not its conception of itself, its promotion of itself, right? ISIS wanted us to believe that its members really were devout and really believed in the prophecy, and in many cases in the imminent apocalypse. But at least in Iraq, what ISIS was primarily was a political organization, a political revolution, as I write in the book.
Comes up often in the book. But
yeah.
At the beginning, the
I write
Caliphate
about
did things. They ran hospitals. They gave out money. At the beginning, it wasn't just.
And that's only once they took ground. Even before that, their appeal to Iraqis as they were taking ground was that we are an alternative for Sunnis, the only alternative to the Iraqi government, to the government of Nouri al-Maliki, and we are going to restore you Sunnis to political power, to economic power. Theirs was a political and economic argument, primarily. They also mentioned religion a lot, of course, but to the Iraqis I know who sided with ISIS or happily abided it, or even joined it,
there's quite a few.
Many. We'll never know how many. The real, or at least the most urgent appeal was as ISIS as an alternative to the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government, which many Sunni Iraqis believed was doing the bidding of Iran, worst of all, that it was a Shia nationalist government that had allowed Iran to take over Iraq. They would say this in so many words. And that doing the bidding of the U.S. and Israel, sometimes people would mention. And I met many people who supported ISIS who also claimed that they found its religious arguments perfectly amenable or admissible. They didn't disagree with the religious arguments, not necessarily, but that was not the primary appeal
Very
of
effective,
the
John.
group.
The thread that runs throughout at first the reassurances were, don't worry about smoking, don't worry about the length of your beard, don't worry about any of that, and then
when they first came in and
took
took over Mosul, one of the many cities they controlled, life actually got somewhat better for many Moslawis anyway. First of all, for the Sunni Iraqi men, all of the abuse they'd been experiencing from the Iraqi army and police ended. All of these Sunni men who I talked to who for years had been accused of soldiers, mainly Shia soldiers who were not from Mosul, who were from Baghdad and points south. For years, the Sunni men of Mosul had been harassed by the soldiers, and they were made to stop at checkpoints and stay for hours sometimes, and being told that they were jihadis and Baathists, and they were jailed indiscriminately, summarily executed, beaten. This had been going on for years. And when ISIS came in, of course, that all ended overnight, literally overnight. And there were no more checkpoints, and there was no more harassment, and there were no more abuse of soldiers calling you a Baathist and a jihadi and an Arab nomad. They improved, they filled in potholes, they improved the markets, they opened new markets, they lowered rents. I spoke with an electrical engineer who worked for the electricity ministry in Mosul, who kept his job, as so many Moslawis did, because what alternative they have? ISIS is the government now, and if it can pay, they can't lose their jobs. Mm-hmm. They have to live. So this particular engineer, who was no great fan of ISIS, but he'd kept his job under them, described to me how ISIS started putting individual electricity meters in people's houses in order to better monitor electricity consumption and cut down on graft, which is something that had never been done before. It didn't work out eventually, but he quite liked the idea. So at least at first, for many people, ISIS did deliver on the improvements it had promised.
And the second thing, the second prong that I want to ask about, I'm sure you've been asked about it already. I'm sure you'll be asked about it again.
Yeah.
In addition to the presence of America on the minds of the Iraqis that you met, when you mentioned that a big proximate cause was the American era, essentially the establishment of ISIS.
Yeah.
That brings to mind immediately one of the epigraphs of your book. It's a figure that we know on this channel, and I want to know if
Mr.
there's
Hitchens?
a story behind it. Yes, I want to read it. I want to read it to you. It's very brief. There's one epigraph here that says that the book is partially dedicated to Christopher Hitchens. You were wrong about Iraq, but right about most everything else. Now you know that would have merited you 2,700 words in the Nation or whatever.
Oh yeah, or at least a good talking to, or a debate. He was happy to debate, all of his causes,
but not to admit wrong ever on anything.
Hitchens would sometimes admit when he'd been wrong about something, but it was rare. He didn't seem to like to do it very much.
So what about?
So
It sounds like there's an argument there that you wish you'd been able to have.
No. Yes. In fact, that I did not. So I started reading Hitchens, like many other people, I suppose, in my early 20s when I became a journalist. And he was writing a column for Vanity Fair, as well as one for Slate, and writing regularly in The Atlantic about books. He had a book column in The Atlantic. He wrote regularly for Harper's. So he was this, as you'll recall, he was this dynamo of journalism and of writing, in a way that, and a public intellectual, in a way that we really have no longer. There's no one who writes that well, that prolifically. There are people who write that prolifically that don't write as well, or who don't write as well. And he was a public intellectual of an intellect so fearsome, I don't know that we'll see its likes again. The breadth of his reading and of his dialectical capability and of his oratory capability, I doubt that I'll ever see its likes in my lifetime. But in 2004, I wrote an article about Hitchens and Paul Berman and Thomas Friedman for a small paper in Los Angeles that no longer exists about what were known as the liberal hawks, which were nominal liberals, a stupid term then and a stupid term now, who supported the invasion of Iraq for one reason or another, and with varying degrees of historical knowledge. The bottom of the pile, of course, was Thomas Friedman, the always idiotic Thomas Friedman. Paul Berman, whose work I quite like and thinking I quite respect, had just published a book called Fear and Terror? No, I'm forgetting. Freedom and Terror? Maybe Freedom and Terror, which was a very good book, an introduction for readers who didn't know about him to such people as Said Khatib, and a recent history of jihadi theory, and a very clear-eyed explanation of how jihadism represented a very clear threat to American values, the best of American values, I should say. And Hitchens made the same argument. Hitchens also argued that that Iraq was part of the network of jihadism, which is wrong, and that it ought to be invaded and could be fixed. Hitchens also was very much an advocate of the Kurdish cause, and I tend to think then and think even more now that his love of the Kurds and his advocacy for Kurdish independence and Kurdish statehood was the main driving factor behind his support for the invasion of Iraq, and his refusal to admit that it might have been a stupid idea, that his refusal to see or to acknowledge just how stridently irrelevant the war in Iraq was to the war on terror, as it used to be known. Iraq was not a locus of jihadism before 2003, nothing like it, but it certainly was after 2003. After 2003, it became the very crucible of contemporary jihadism. And the evidence of that has only accumulated since, including the emergence of ISIS. So when